carry anywhere. We are your hosts and hopefully your new bookish pals. I'm Hannah MacDonald.
And I'm Lydia Clare. Today's episode is another instalment in our Top of Your TBR series, where we ask the people we admire to share 4 of their ultimate reading recommendations.
Today's guest is the wonderful Cherie Jones. Cherie Jones is a writer and lawyer from Barbados. Cherie is a graduate of the MA Writing Programme at Sheffield Hallam University, where she won both the Archie Markham Award and the AM Heath Prize. Her short stories have been broadcast on BBC Radio 4 and published in Hank, Cadenza and Eclectica. Her debut novel, How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House, was shortlisted the Women's Prize for Fiction in 2021. And we are so thrilled to have Cherie with us today. So Cherie, welcome to A Pair of Bookends.
Thank you so much. I am absolutely over the moon to be here. Thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be here today.
Oh, you're very welcome. We're happy you're here. Now, what we like to ask, first of all, and our bookends will know this, is the most important question of the whole podcast. I'm sorry, but it is, Hannah. Okay. And that is, what are you currently reading?
So currently I am reading Happening, a book called Happening. It's a very slim book by Annie Arnaud. And this is the first book that I've read of hers, and it has me just on the edge of my seat. Just sort of, it's a very personal book. It's about a woman who becomes pregnant and decides not to continue the pregnancy. But the way that it's written is so profound, so moving. And there are parts of it where literally I've just found myself gripping the edge of my chair as I read it. So it's fantastic. Yes, that's what I'm reading.
Straight to my list.
That's another one for our list, bookends. Yeah. Oh my goodness.
And it's so rare that we get to hear stories of women choosing not to continue a pregnancy. I think that's a really important story to be told.
Relevant right now, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And she's known for writing stories about the personal. And I think that's something that for a long time in literature was not regarded as being very, profound. It's absolutely the opposite as far as I'm concerned. And this book really demonstrates that for me in a very personal and a very, very moving way. So I can't recommend it enough. It's a wonderful book.
I'm going to be ordering that straight after this.
I'll just shut up, Ramuel.
So before we get into your picks for our Top of the TBR series, we would love to chat about your debut novel, which was, of course, published early last year, but I was very late to the game.
Too late.
Lydia's not impressed.
I was bent in her ear for too long.
She was practically hitting me around the head with your book. That's...
Yay, Lydia.
I'm not ashamed to say I did use it as a weapon.
But I mean, thank God you did, because it is an incredible book and, it's rightfully received much acclaim. At which point did you realise that your book had taken off, and what was the experience like for you as a debut author?
Oh my gosh, the experience. I describe it as a roller coaster, and it's kind of the one that you're on when it's, when the roller coaster is just climbing and you just don't want it to stop. There's this feeling of euphoria, disbelief. It's surreal. I still pinch myself sometimes. I just can't believe it. This is something that was a dream of mine for over 20 years, to be able to publish internationally. So I'm one of the writers who was kind of slogging away between the day job and all the other things I have to do, real life.
Yeah.
And it took a while. So yeah, it's absolutely a dream come true for me. I still don't know if I feel like the book has made it. I just feel like this story has traveled so far. I'm so happy that it has a strong pair of legs and it just keeps running. And I don't think we've really sort of arrived yet. I don't know if it ever will, but the response that I've had from the public, from readers the world over, has just been so gratifying. These characters were in my head for a long time. So to have that world shared with other people and to have people willingly participate and feel these characters and enjoy the story, it just means the world to me.
Amazing.
It's an incredible,
It really
incredible
is.
novel.
It really is.
Really is.
And I think, you know, you saying that will be so inspiring to so many writers.
Keep going.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, definitely. And I sort of was the person who was writing, and then I'd read an article about like a 17-year-old who got this huge book deal, based on part of a manuscript. And I would just be, amazed, but just sort of feel like, okay, so, when is my sort of dream come true gonna happen? And I had to step back from that and redefine success for me in that regard. And it's so ironic that it's when I kind of just accepted my journey for what it was, that's when it happened. That's when I got the book deal and things started to happen from there.
Yeah, I feel like that's quite a common theme actually with a lot of people. Like we're both actors, and a lot of time when you start sort of looking for stuff, it tends to come to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
A lot of the time, I found that.
I think for most creatives, it's sort of like you have to remind yourself like why you do what you do. And it really isn't for the recognition. The recognition is validating, but it's not central to who you are as a creative. It's not central to what you're about. And I think I had to remind myself of that for on a few occasions, when I felt a little bit like things weren't going the way that I'd hoped or dreamed. So yeah, that's most writers that I meet now who haven't yet published and who have that as an objective, because not everybody does. I kind of share that aspect of my journey because I think it's really important for people to understand and appreciate. Yeah,
absolutely. I love how we're both like, yes, yeah. Now, What Else Is There? It does tackle those darker elements and the kind of more difficult subject matters, such as domestic violence, grief, loss. What do you kind of draws you to those subjects, and what kind of made you want to center them in the novel?
Yeah, so this is a very personal book for me in more ways than one. I was kind of the very bookish kid, very voracious reader. And there were these particular books written by West Indian authors, male authors, that I started reading at a very young age, and I would return to over time. So over the years, as I grew into myself, as a Caribbean woman writer of color, I would come back to these stories, and it was so fascinating to me that when I came back, I'd see the story differently each time. And one book was The Hills Were Joyful Together by Roger Mayes, and the other was Miguel Street by V.S. Naipaul. And both of those books deal with domestic violence in the Caribbean, gender-based violence, and specifically violence against women. And one of them has this, The Hills Were Joyful Together, has some pretty graphic depictions of violence against women. And, the first time I read it, I was sort of, there was this kind of horror about it, but I read it and I sort of more aware of gender-based violence in my own community. And then, coming back to those books and reading them was almost painful, in part. Yeah. So when I received this story of the one-armed sister, when the inspiration for that story came to me, I kind of made up in my mind that I was going to approach this theme a little differently from I had read. So yeah, it just seems to be, it's something that really is unfortunately a scourge in the Caribbean. We've had a former United Nations Commissioner for Human Rights come to the Caribbean and say, gender-based violence is a global issue. It's something that happens all over the world, but that it's particularly prevalent in the Caribbean. And she actually said that. And from my observation, that's true. And I was really curious about why. And when I things that I had observed and these books that I had read, and how violence against women was talked about in these books, how that element was woven into the story, I became really intrigued about how I would represent violence in my own novel. So yeah, it's pretty dark themes, but that's how it came about.
But, dark themes, but beautifully explored.
Yeah.
And I read an interview that you did with Hatchet, and they asked you to describe your book in 3 words, and you said survival is triumph, which
Yes.
I love. And I
Yeah.
think you definitely get a sense of that. You know, whilst it does explore dark themes, there's a definite sense of hope and survival in there. How did survival come to be such a central theme in the book?
Yeah, you know, I think because it's something that, again, I saw all around me. I mean, when you think about a character like Wilma, for example, who is one half of what is essentially a child marriage. And she is actually also a victim of violence in her own right. And that's not how we look at her in the novel. We look at her more as, you know, Lala's grandmother. Lala is the main character for those of us who might not have read the book as yet. And I think we look at Wilma in relation to how she deals with Lala. And perhaps when we look at her in that light, there isn't a lot of praise for her and how she deals with Lala based on what Lala has gone through. But Wilma herself is a survivor. And I think just the fact of her survival is a triumph in its own right. So I think a lot of women in this novel and in the Caribbean and in the world are dealing or have dealt with some pretty traumatic experiences. And I think we need to start to appreciate that just being able to survive the experience is a triumph in itself. It's a victory. And I became more sensitive to that the more I looked around me. So it was really important for me that that be clear with the characters in how the one-armed sister sweeps her house.
And I think, I mean, we've touched on this before, but we think of like Barbados and the Caribbean as kind of this idyllic place to live, and you know, we dream of as Westerners, you know, we dream of these beautiful beaches and endless sunny days, and you know, and and we do have this romanticized version in our heads of what it is actually like. And I think this novel, your novel particularly, explores the kind of darker, more realistic side of life in a beautiful way. How much did you want to include that kind of realism, you know, that darker side of a place that we you know, hold up?
So the first thing I would want to say is that Barbados, you know, we are all that. We are sort of the brilliant sunshine and the hammock on the pink sand beach and frothy drinks with little paper umbrellas, probably made in China, but still. And the coconut trees and all that. We are that, but we also have a lot of the same social issues and that other countries have. There is that sort of dark underbelly, as there is anywhere in the world. And for me, this side of Barbados that I chose to portray had everything to do with the story. And, you know, I often say with my writing, the only thing that I'm loyal to, if I go through my process and I do it well, the only thing that I'm loyal to in the end is the story. And that darker side of life in Barbados is the side of life that these characters experience. So that is not to say that there isn't a very beautiful, sort of very leisurely, laid back, and even luxurious side of Barbados, but that wasn't the side experienced by the characters in this story. So I had to be really ruthless about what made it into that story, because I had to be true to Barbados as experienced by Lala, as experienced by Tone and Aiden and the Queen of Sheba. So in the end, that's the side that came out a lot in the novel, because that is true to, that is the authentic experience for these characters. So really what determines which side of the island goes into any of my stories and went into this novel is just what the characters' experience is, what the story requires.
Yeah.
We're just like in awe.
Completely in awe.
Go on. It's like
I can listen to you all
you ask
day.
a question, I'm still talking. But anyway.
No, I
No.
could listen to you all day.
Stop speaking. I'm like, carry on. Yeah, it's fine.
The wisdom of Cherie, that's what we're going to title them. So the title, How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House, which is an epic title. I love that title. It's linked to the cautionary folktale, which is almost like a centerpiece in the novel. And like the folktale is passed on through the generations in the book, so is a sort of shared trauma. But what power does Caribbean folklore hold in this story for you?
It's so central to this story and what it is about. I mean, storytelling, and particularly the oral tradition, is very much a part of life in the Caribbean. I mean, I grew up sort of having that same experience that Lala has, when the older members of the community warn you away from certain aspects of or certain types of behavior, or transfer conventional wisdom through storytelling. So for me, when I was younger, I remember it was, don't go outside after dark because the grease man could get you. And you know, it was and it's like just trying to think was horrible in itself. So you know, usually these tales would accomplish, you know, the objective of scaring you into behaving. And that's really what this story, what one that is generally told. But also I wanted to show a little bit of how these stories differ for boys and girls. So for me growing up, for example, that story about possibly being, you know, being captured by the grease man would be a story that would be more told to girls, young girls, than it would be for boys. So there's some interesting, even our approaches to gender performance transferred in that sort of conventional wisdom. And that was something I wanted to explore a little bit in the novel. So it was very important for me to have that tale in there. And also I kind of wanted to show, you know, Lala is pretty badass. And when she's a teenager, she's like, well, you know, so if I go in and, you know, the monster get me, I can still get a husband and I can still have a couple children. I can still get a house. So the tale doesn't really accomplish the objective at, you know, because she's like, so what? I get a monster, I escape from the monster. Life goes on. I can still do stuff, you know. And her grandmother, and then her grandmother kind of says, stupid girl, you know, how are you gonna sweep it? And it ends there. And that tale is also about parameters that we sort of put in place for women in Caribbean society. We sort of very much restrict women on the basis of the domestic. So, you know, the ability to sweep a house and to keep a clean house when I was growing up was a real thing. Like you had to be able to, a girl who could not sweep, that was like a real problem. And the older women would say that, you know, and I was kind of the one who was like, sweeping, not a big deal. So it's also, I think that tale is also about sort of being able to question those parameters for women and think about how, you know, those sorts of tales contribute to our attitudes and approaches to gender-based violence, because I don't think we often make that connection. And it very much is there.
Now, I mean, I could sit here and talk about
your book
about One-Armed Sister literally all night, and I've got a feeling that Hannah's going to kick me in the ribs because I actually would just talk about that and forget what we're here for.
Oh my god, yeah.
But anyway, the reason why we've got you here is for your top of your TBR choices, and it is an eclectic and very exciting mix of books that you've picked for us. And we were both kind of, when we first got it, we're like, what? And it's been such a wonderful experience being able to discover these novels. So your first pick is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke.
Yes.
So can you tell us why you picked this book?
Oh my gosh. I love Piranesi because, first of all, it's just masterful storytelling. What I loved about this book is it appears to weave an alternative universe, but the reader's ability to engage with this universe, to me, proves the thesis of the novel. So that's maybe that's a pretty sort of complicated, not very clear way of saying, the theme of this book for me was how our minds can help us to process trauma, and how the creation of this alternative universe can almost be a balm, a gift of sorts. And I am personally, in my writing, I'm fascinated by themes of lunacy and, what we might look at as mental illness. And how that may actually be a response to trauma. And I just find that in this book, I mean, this alternate universe is so meticulously crafted. So this book was one of the finalists for the Women's Prize in the year that my book was also a finalist. And I made it a point, I did not read the other shortlisted books before the ceremony. And then when Susanna won, I thought, okay, I have to read this book. And I picked it up the first time, and it was a little tough getting into it. Maybe by the end of the second chapter, let's say, I was just hooked.
Yeah.
And it was just the ability to draw me into this alternative universe it was masterful. And I had to kind of, tip my hat to her and say, wow, I wish I could like that. So it's an amazing story, not only in the crafting, but the theme of this story really resonates with me. It's just beautifully told.
Yeah, it really is. And I had no idea in what direction this book was going to pull me in.
Was going to go.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, it's masterful the way that she's done that.
Yeah, because when I started to read it, I thought, okay, like, first of all, I couldn't understand who the main character was. I couldn't figure out, was this a human being? Was this some sort of, otherworldly creature? But just following, these wonderful halls and all these statutes and figures. And I just was trying to figure out, my mind was just trying to wrap itself around what was actually happening. And, after a while, I was fully immersed in this place. And it was just my ability then as a reader to get into this imaginary world and to really experience it as the character did, and finally to understand it, and maybe even to be able to explain it at a point in time where I was so fully sold that, understanding the genesis of that universe was probably less important. But it was masterful. It was breathtaking. I loved every minute of reading that book.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you chose this, because Lydia had already read it.
It's another one that I was beating her over the head with.
And I hadn't. And the reason I hadn't picked it up was I was so convinced I wouldn't like this book. And I think because it slots into the category of fantasy, that's not my go-to genre. So it did, I came to it with a what's the word I'm looking for?
A bit of bias against
it. Like a bit of bias, And I was so wrong. I'll hold my hands up. I was wrong.
But that's the thing. That was the same for me. I sort of thought, okay, this is like a fantasy book. I'm not really into fantasy. And that was, I had that bias going into it. But I really think this book is like genre defying. To me, this is like, this is just a beautiful story, wonderfully told. And that's all it is. And that's, that says it all. this was one of the most moving books for me. Like, I'll never forget this one.
No, it is unforgettable. And so, you know, like you just said, like, you're probably similar to me in the sense that you wouldn't typically go for a fantasy book. But do you think that after reading this now, maybe that's changed your mind on fantasy?
Well, sort of yes and no. I sort of, you know, I think that great stories are great stories. And sometimes when we try to reduce a story to a particular genre, it can be off-putting for some people.
Yeah.
So for me, on one hand, I'd say yes, because I will pick up another book that's expressed to be a fantasy story or a fantasy novel and read it because of what I've learned from this book, because of what this book has shown me. I think I'm less concerned now with how other people categorize the story. And I just want to see if it's something that resonates with me and that I enjoy. So yes, I'd have to say, I don't think I will be, you know, I'll be sort of picking up every fantasy novel. But I think it certainly made me a lot more open-minded and more willing to just pick up a story and, you know, like it or leave it on its own merits and less on what people say it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it took Susanna Clarke over 10 years to write this novel.
Yes.
Do you think that kind of time equals quality when it comes to writing?
Wow, that is an excellent question. I think you can't. I mean, a really, really good one. I think you can't help but if you're working on something steadily, and polishing that manuscript as you go, and you take a number of years, it's probably going to be really a well-realized story, a fully realized story, or a really well-crafted story by the time you're done, because you've taken that time and that effort to really get into it and to polish it. But I wouldn't say that that's always the case. I've written stories. I remember I wrote this flash fiction piece while I was studying, while I was doing my MA. And I remember it was just because I was working on a longer piece and I had writer's block. And this colleague of mine in class said, well, why don't you try writing some flash? You know, that's what I do to get around writer's block. And I thought, what is flash? I'd never heard of flash fiction. And I wrote this story in like less than an hour, a flash fiction piece. And that was one of the few stories that I've ever written that was so close to done when it came out, when I got it on the page. So I don't think that time always equals quality, but I think there's a very good chance if you've taken a lot of time on it that it's gonna be good.
It is no surprise to me that you are capable of whipping something up in an hour. That's
of course you can.
There she is. Chucking out some magic. Okay.
Well, I don't know. That is definitely not always the case. I mean, for a long time, I was that person kind of, I described it as sort of feeling around in a dark room for the like with some of my stories. And I'd be writing, and it was, sort of like tearing things up and, deleting bits and then being sorry I deleted them. I do that still sometimes, but I think I'm getting a little bit better now at understanding what's right and what's wrong and how to get there.
So one thing I wanted to speak about when I read Piranesi was obviously the character of Piranesi, and I think Piranesi has a really strong narrative voice, and is the lens through which we see this sort of rich and vivid world. Do you feel the character of Piranesi totally shapes this story?
I would say definitely. For me, it was like that character was so, even though I'd never met I don't even want to say any person, because at first I genuinely did not think it was a human being. I started off thinking Piranesi is, sort of half horse, half man, something that I couldn't even wrap my mind around. But yet still there was something about it that was so authentic. We understood that Piranesi had a particular approach to detail, for example, a lot of detail about just little things, very observant character, a very sort of almost lofty way of speaking and seeing the world. But this person who is slightly eccentric, slightly offbeat that you've met in real life and you can't help but love and find fascinating. And after a while, that in itself compelled me to read on because I wanted to understand what was happening with this person. So yes, how Piranesi saw the world was it for me, because there was no other voice to sort of compare Piranesi's account with. So we had to get fully into seeing this world as Piranesi saw it. And that was, for me, there's this character who comes in very near the end, the female detective. It was almost like when she came in, it was almost like it was the other way around. I had to try to understand where she was coming from or what world she was coming from, because I was so into the one that Piranesi had painted for me. So it was wonderful. And I think Susanna did an excellent job of making this character human and recognizable in terms of emotions, while still being eccentric and otherworldly, and you couldn't quite grasp what Piranesi might look like. For example, for me at the beginning, that was difficult. I was kind of trying to figure out, so what does Piranesi actually look like? But yeah, it was just, I think those sort of lovable qualities and being able to really feel that character really helped. So definitely Piranesi's view framed the entire world for me. And I thought that was a wonderful thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's an incredible novel. If you have not read Piranesi yet, I'm here again to shout at you.
Yes, you absolutely must. I came away, there are books that I've read over the course of my life that I never forget. That's one of those books that I went into that book as one person and I came out of that book as another person.
Yeah.
Like I was changed by that book. And that's always a sign for me of a really great novel. So yeah.
It's always high up on my list of recommendations.
Yeah.
Like when someone asks you, oh, do you know a good book? Oh, well. And then I tell them, don't read anything about it. Just start it. If you don't know anything about it, because otherwise you get preconceived ideas.
Yeah.
So I could talk about Piranesi all day, but there are 3 more choices that you've come to us with. So your second choice is When We Were Birds by Ayanna Lloyd-Banwo. So why has this made your list?
Right. So I think what I loved about When We Were Birds, first of all, is the way it portrays the magic and the mystery that is Caribbean life. And that is part of our inheritance. It starts with this folk tale being communicated from your DJ's grandmother to her. And it's like when you start reading this story, again, it's a little otherworldly. You kind of think like, what was she talking about there? What's that about? But that is, for us in the Caribbean, that is real. And it was magical, but it was real. And I could identify with it. I also loved the narrative voice and the fact that it was a Trini voice. Like the music of the narrative voice was refreshing for me. It was kind of like, this is like somebody that I know sitting down and telling me this story, and that there was something very familiar and very warm and very comforting about that. So I loved that. I loved also the way that it dealt with death and our relationship to death. And I couldn't have known it at the time, but sometimes in my life, I feel as if the books that I read, often quite by chance, kind of almost prepare me in a way. And it's fiction that I'm reading usually, but it prepares me for things that I experience in real life after. Strange as that may sound. And I love the fact that one character is kind of running away from death. Your DJ doesn't want this gift that the women in her family have. And Darwin is kind of running towards death. He's down on his luck. He decides to take a job in a cemetery, what we would call, we say as a graveyard in the Caribbean. And we look at that a little sort of side eye, that's not a great job. And especially for him as a Rastafarian, a member of the Rastafarian community, that is like a no. So he's running towards death in one sense. She's running away from it. They collide, and the outcome for me is beautiful. It really is beautiful. And there's a great lesson in this story about death and what it should mean for us, because on another level, on a connotative level, these characters die to who they were at the beginning of the story, and they become something else by its end. So death is sort of portrayed as just a stage, and how these characters deal with death and deal with who they become afterwards is really inspirational for me. So this was just a very sort of lush, lyrical Caribbean story about a huge theme, and I thought it was wonderfully told. So that was why I loved When We Were Birds.
I mean, I don't think anyone can top that that commentary of the book. That's all we've got time for today.
But,
I can't top that explanation. It's
I just this was one of the, again, I mean, I read some fantastic books over the past year, but this is like, when I read this book, there were points at the book I actually, like, I don't like to admit this, but I put like a little dog ear, because what was on that page was so moving and so profound or so lyrical. It was like I just had to put a little dog ear and go back and read it again. Like,
and I'm so glad you've said that, because I do the exact same, and Lydia hates it.
Bookmarks were invented.
I found my partner in crime.
Yay for us. I do that. I know that, everybody says you shouldn't dog it, but it's like, I need to be able to come out and find that page and have that experience again. Or sometimes you read something on a page and it's so profound. It's like you get a meaning, but you have to go back to it and you get something else, and it sort of unravels over time in the mind. So this is one of those books to me for sure. And the cover is beautiful.
Oh my gosh, the cover. The cover I just get it out.
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah, it's
beautiful cover.
And I am a very cover-oriented reader. I will be drawn to a cover, and I saw that, and I was like, okay, need this book. And I'm so pleased that you chose it. And I think what you were saying about the story being told through this dialect, like, I think that is a really important aspect of it, because I feel like that makes the world even more vivid. Through which we see these characters. And Lydia's got all of this to look forward to, because Lydia's not ready yet, and I'm going to be pestering her to read it. It's my turn now.
It's true.
This is one of those, I often wonder, though, one of the things I wanted to ask was whether, how, if you haven't sort of experienced or heard a Trinidadian person speak before, I wondered how somebody from another part of the world would sort of get into that lilt, that sort of music. But I just felt she did such a wonderful job of bringing that across. I really felt like somebody, like I said, somebody was sort of giving me a warm hug and telling me this story sort of down the road, in that voice and in that language that I understand. So I hope it was as wonderful for readers who are not from the Caribbean. As it was.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you know, when I first started reading it, I was like, oh, like this is the dialect that we're going into. But like I said, I think it, you know, it makes this world even more vivid. Because you can hear, it's like you can hear the characters even more.
As soon as you get it, you've got it, haven't you?
And I think, did it do it in Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo?
Yeah, she had
there was characters had and I think even with that as well, like that paints these characters to you, you know, and it makes them really, they become bold and they become, I don't know, I felt like it immersed me in this world. It's a very immersive style, isn't it?
Yeah, I found that with the girl with the louding voice.
Oh, yeah.
That book is absolutely fantastic in terms of voice. You know, this, and it's so you can hear her speaking, you know, and you can hear her telling you the story. It's like an audiobook in your head.
Yes, while you're reading it. Yeah,
absolutely.
I love books like that. Yeah.
And I think, you know, you described Piranesi earlier as genre defying, but I think When We Were Birds is definitely genre defying. And it's I don't understand how it's a debut. It's incredible.
So accomplished. And that was another one, because you kind of, when you read that folk tale, that myth at the beginning, that sort of story passed down from one generation to the other, you might kind of think, okay, is this magical realism? Is this, you know, but by the time you get into this novel, this is a very real story. And I love how it sort of, it merges the otherworldly and the very realistic day-to-day Caribbean existence. And it's like it's two sides of the same coin. And that's one of the things I think it does so well. You kind of feel as if, you know, these two things go hand in hand. And that really is what it's like for me as a Caribbean person. There is this sort of magical aspect to life here. And there's this very sort of gritty, realistic aspect. And the two go hand in hand. So she does that really well.
Absolutely. But do you feel that there's a hunger for these stories now? Like, do you feel there's a bigger hunger for it?
Yeah, I think there is. I think, you know, we've had so many wonderful storytellers from the Caribbean present their stories from the Caribbean perspective through that lens of being from this part of the world. And that's been happening for years and years. But somehow I feel as if we're now really coming into our own, even in terms of the voice, the narrative voice in which these stories are told is so clearly our own. And I just feel like, you know, this is the time people are approaching this world and this perspective with an open mind, and, you know, being able to be immersed in what it's like to live here or to be from here. And I think that's wonderful. I didn't really feel that as much, you know, when I was, say, you know, a 13-year-old girl, but definitely I think there is that openness to different perspectives now. And that is so wonderful to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've noticed that there are common themes in the books you've picked and in your own work. And particularly I found around the juxtaposition of death and survival, and how they seem to be very, very present within quite a few choices and within your novel itself. And what draws you to those subjects?
Wow.
Everything.
I mean, you're asking questions today that are just, you know, they're so incisive, and I just have to kind of, I don't know. I think I have always been fascinated by duality. And I just feel as if, you know, I always kind of have this perspective of, you know, like, say Barbados. I'm looking at Barbados as this beautiful, wonderful island in the Caribbean. And lots of visitors come here, and it's about the rum punch, and it's about, you know, like I said, the sand and the sunshine and so on. And there's this other aspect of Barbados as well. And I'm fascinated by that. Which aspect people see often depends on who they are and what they bring to the experience. And that's true even of human beings, you know, who we are. There's the wonderful side that we all have. And then maybe there are the sides that are not that wonderful. And it's sort of like, so can we acknowledge all of who we are? Can we acknowledge all of a particular place, of a person, of an idea, of a perspective? I'm fascinated by that. And it, it's something that comes up again and again in my work. So it's perhaps not surprising that that these stories that I've chosen do that as well. And, some of them explore dark subject matter, for example, but they do it in beautiful prose. They're beautifully written stories. The language sings. It's gorgeous to look at and to read out loud, but what it's talking about is like, it's hard to wrap your mind around. And I grew up reading Toni Morrison, for example, and she's somebody who does that extremely well. So, her language and the words that she chooses and the way she puts words together is just so beautiful. But the subject matter is like so dark at times, and it's that's fascinating for me. So yeah, not surprising that those are the stories that sort of piqued my interest, and also that's something that I explore in my own writing. Yeah.
Oh god, I love Toni Morrison.
Yeah.
Who doesn't? I know. Yeah. True. So when we were birds, one thing that I loved about this book was the sort of unconventional love story that's at the heart of it. And as we were saying before, we were speaking about it being sort of genre defying, but how did you feel that the book kind of played with these romance tropes?
That is one of the things that I particularly loved about it. One of the things I love about Khadijah and Darwin is, Khadijah comes from a line of women who they are the leaders in the family. You kind of get the impression that this is really a sort of matriarchal family setup. And the men are very supportive. And it's like so for me, I'm fascinated by gender and gender performance and how we act out gender and sexuality in the Caribbean and in our fiction. And that's one of the things that I really loved about this book, the way that those roles, I think Ayanna sort of plays with that a little bit. And I loved that. And also, I think this was a story that didn't go down the usual romance line. It wasn't kind of, they met and they fell in love and there was a huge fight, or there was sort of somebody else maybe who was a possible love interest. The conflict wasn't that way. The conflict really for these characters was within. It was internal to each of them. And they sort of helped each other to resolve it. And that was, for me, was unusual. That made it an unusual love story. So yeah, I loved how she did that. I thought that was unique. Yeah.
Me too. And I mean, like I said before, that I had a bias prior to reading Piranesi against like the fantasy genre. And I know there's a lot of romance lovers out there, don't come for me, but romance isn't a genre that I gravitate towards either. Unless it's slotted into like a contemporary fiction novel, like it's not something as a particular genre I would go for. So I'm always fascinated with it being played with in other genres. So your third choice was, am I going to get this whole thing right?
It's a long time.
Important artifacts and personal property.
I know it's what we're going to.
From the collection of Lenore Doolan and Harold Morris, including books, street fashion, and jewellery by Leanne Shapton. Now, we were so intrigued by the title of this book, and we're gutted because we couldn't get hold of it. So can you tell us more about this book?
Oh, this book. I came across this book in 2013 while I was studying for my MA in writing at Sheffield Hallam University. This book is another one of those that just changed my life. So this book is a novel. It's so innovative in terms of the novel form. And it's a love story told in the form of an auction catalog. I wish I'd thought of that. And basically, it tells the love story of Lenore Doolan and Harold Morris from the time they meet until even after they break up. And what's fascinating for me is the characterization and how Shapton accomplishes that characterization without having the luxury of a lot of words to do it in.
Yeah.
So, and she doesn't have dialogue, for example. It's not, or well, she has very little dialogue that she can play with. It's really kind of notes on a napkin, and it's a postcard, and it's a gift, and it's a letter that was sent, and photographs, and still, you know, every nuance of these two characters, of their personalities and how they interact in this love affair is beautifully rendered on the page. I could not put this book down. It was the book that sort of, first of all, told me that it was okay to have a very long title.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that, Leanne, because, you know, I kind of struggled with that at first, but the title is perfect for the novel, and it almost plays with the form in that. In a way, it's almost as if there are more words in the title than they are in the novel itself. So I found that interesting, fascinating as well. So that's the first thing I got from it. But then also, how can you sort of fully realize and fully portray authentic characters with very few words? There's an economy of language, and she's writing as much with the spaces, right, with the lack of words, as she is with what she's able to get down on the page, both in terms of the photographs and in terms of like the captions in the auction catalog. I found this book fascinating. So it really, like I said, it's a love story in the form of an auction catalog. It's about this relationship between a photographer and this woman who works, a younger woman who works for the New York Times, I think it was. And they have this, there's this great love story. They meet at this Halloween party. You can almost just see how they're just like drawn to each other. And they go through all the stages that we all do. So part of the auction catalog, for example, is she's getting ready for a date with Harold, and she's trying on all these different outfits. And her friend, who's a fashion stylist, is there to advise her about what to wear. And we don't hear, and this is the thing, because we aren't told all of that. But what we see in this particular lot in the auction catalog is the snapshots of each outfit taken by this friend who's a fashion stylist before the date. And straight away we get it. You know, we get it. We've all been there. And there's this friend who has more fashion sense and is kind of saying, well, yeah, that one, not that one. Yes, no, whatever. We've all been there. And it kind of makes that character come alive in all her vulnerability, her desire to be loved. I mean, there is, over the course of the relationship, I think we get to the point where she starts to realize some things that perhaps we could see a little bit at the beginning. We can see how self-absorbed Harold is, how he sort of prioritizes his own career over and maybe looks at hers as less important. We see all the things that she does to please him, and we see that slight shift where she sort of begins to claim that self back. And, you know, it was so familiar for me. And what I found fascinating was that Leanne Shapton wasn't writing this down. It was all through the auction catalog, through the snapshots, through the notes on a napkin, through the gifts that they gave to each other at Christmas and what that said about the characters. I loved this book. It's a quick read for those of us who might not have a whole set of time, but again, a really moving story.
I love that. It sounds incredible.
Yeah.
Absolutely incredible. So, I mean, the format itself sounds just fascinating. Like an auction catalogue is just absolutely bonkers, but brilliant at the same time. What was that like as a reading experience for you?
I think when I sort of, it was on my reading list, like I said, and when I kind of opened it and I saw the the photographs and just the little captions underneath, I thought, like it was like mind blowing. I thought, okay, what it did, I think, was heightened my curiosity, not only about the book itself, but about the story of the love between these two characters. I mean, and that was interesting for me at first, was almost to overread it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So like you kind of look at these photos and you look for significance in all sorts of things. She gives him the words, the tiles to spell thank you from a Scrabble board. That's one of the gifts she gives after they have this wonderful experience. And she gives him just the tile spelling thank you. And he spells 3 different sort of phrases, which when I read them, I thought, oh, they say a lot about him. I can't remember. One of them was something like hunk something. And, you know, he's very self-absorbed. So when I saw that, I thought, oh, yeah, that's why he would spell those words. What the effect that has on the reader, or at least the effect that it had on me, was I felt like I was participating in telling this story.
Yeah.
I felt that there was enough space there for me to fully engage and to make that story something that I could identify with and I could understand and I wanted to work through in my mind. So I think there's it heightened curiosity for me. And I think that made for an out of this world reading experience, because I really approached that text with, sort of like a magnifying glass.
Yeah.
As I read, it was like, okay, what does this mean? Like, does this mean something in the context of this story? But beautiful, beautiful. And again, so relatable. I mean, who hasn't done the things that these characters have done? Who hasn't sort of dressed up for the date and couldn't decide what to wear? Who hasn't, sort of reached out tentatively when you're not quite sure if the other person loves you as much as you think you love them? And you're kind of trying to couch the interaction like, okay, well, I'm interested, but I'm not a psychopath or a stalker. But do you feel the same way?
Yeah.
There was definitely that for me at the beginning. So again, unforgettable experience, reading experience, or just experience of this story.
I mean, when we saw when you sent across the 4 titles and I read this one, we were like, this is so rogue. Is this like a non-fiction? Is it an actual auction catalogue? Like what? And then we read up on it and we were like, oh, it's actually a novel. Like that's so clever the way that she's played with that, because you do read that title and automatically have this preconceived idea of what it actually is.
Yeah.
And I mean, I read and I read online about it that there's sort of somebody said there's a voyeuristic pleasure in sifting through the photos of these objects. And I mean, did you get a sense of that? Like,
oh my goodness, yes. Oh God. This is like I had this experience of this acquaintance of mine got married, and when I say acquaintance, it's not somebody that I was like a close friend with. I didn't go to the wedding or anything, but she brought the pictures into the place that I was working to show to somebody else, and I was just there like, yeah, I want to see the pictures. Like I really, my how I had her pictured in my mind, it was almost like there was this sense of wanting to see whether the photos of the wedding would match the photos that I had in my mind.
Yeah.
And it also gives you the opportunity to sort of have this little glimpse and be able to say, yeah, so that happened to her too. And it is partially because it looks like it's real. When you read this book, you think this is an actual love story between 2 actual people and things went wrong. And straight away you think of the one, for me that went wrong. And I kind of want to look at those pictures and see if, like she had some of the same steps and experiences.
Yeah.
So your final choice for top of your TBR is What Storm, What Thunder. I'm gonna go and say that again because I just butchered that. I'm sorry.
That was terrible.
was What Storm, What Thunder by Miriam J.A. Chansey. What did you love about this book?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Again, this was one of those books where the author writes so beautifully about such a tragic and horrific event. And it was like there were parts of this novel where I couldn't look away. You know, when an author is writing about something that's really difficult and you kind of want to just look away from it because it's so heart-wrenching, or it's so difficult to deal with, but you just can't look away. This is one of those books to me. So it's 10 interlinked short stories. It's a novel in short stories. That's how I would categorize it, about an earthquake that took place in Haiti in January 2010. And it's 10 stories from the perspectives of 10 people impacted by this earthquake. And the earthquake is ironically called Dews, which in Creole means sort of sweet, a sweet thing, but it really isn't. What I found difficult to deal with was the suffering that these characters endure. But again, this novel was really about the triumph of the human spirit, and about the intrinsic resilience of these people, of the Haitian people. I mean, Haiti has suffered so much in so many ways for such a long time. And this book was almost like, an elegy. It was, an ode to how resilient and how triumphant Haitians are as a people. Yeah, and some of the stories here were just so moving. I mean, I actually teared up when reading some of these stories. So this was one of those books that will stay with me for the rest of my life.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
For me too. I think it was so incredibly moving. Particularly there are characters in it who have lost people that are very close to them, lost children, lost family members, are sort of find it so difficult to process that loss in the wake of the devastation of everything that happened.
Yeah.
And I felt like that was explored so well. That kind of, having to deal with grief is a difficult thing anyway, but in those circumstances when everything is destroyed around you as well, I thought it was such an important story to tell. And again, I think it doesn't shy away from those darker traumatic events, that darker side of these tragedies. Why do you think that the novel did that so well? Because I really believe that it just tackled all of those difficult, horrific things with such a kind of light hand. You felt very safe the whole way through, because I don't know, it felt like you were being taken on this journey and you were being introduced to all these characters, and it felt very much like a learning experience, despite the fact that it was fiction, obviously, but it felt very, very realistic. So why do you think the novel did this so well?
Well, the first thing I think is exactly what you said, that it was very subtly rendered. There was a very light touch in dealing with devastation and tragedy. And I think that was particularly well done in this book because, a tragedy of this magnitude, an earthquake, is difficult to deal with because devastation is all around for these characters. So, even for me personally, when dealing with grief, or a loss, it helps to have I don't want to say a north point, but it helps to have things around be familiar and to be normal and to be as they were before the tragedy happened, before this big life-changing event happened. And I think that is a luxury that these characters do not have. And I think what the author does is she just gives a very light touch. Because the stories are interlinked, we also get warnings. So when the first story is Malu, I think it is, the market, the market vendor, the woman in the market. And we hear a little bit about this woman who has lost not only her twin girls, but also her son. So all three children are lost. And there is that warning, and you get it from the perspective of a bystander. She's also suffered, but she sort of starts to put things into perspective. So by the time that we get the children in awful circumstances, not just the fact of the earthquake, but how the children actually die. And I mean, the death of a child, and I know this even from my own novel, is something that is really hard to deal with in fiction, to write well. But she gives us a warning, she gives us some perspective, and therefore when she actually plunges us into this almost disassociative state that mother goes through, we have a north point. It isn't what we would normally have, what somebody grieving would normally have. So nothing is normal, but we have somebody who has sort of set some context and told us the quote unquote reality of what happened. And that's something that I think is really successful as well in dealing with this difficult topic, to have these different perspectives and to get those warnings. A very light touch in how she does the book, and just beautiful lyrical language that's hard to turn away from.
Wow. I've not read it yet, but you've been, it sounds so like powerful. So obviously you were both speaking about the way the authors handled certain topics in the book, and like you said, you know, it handles a real life event, you know, a tragic real life event, and I guess it must be really difficult for an author to write a real life event like that, because there's so much devastation, and you know, you will have to really tread carefully about the way it's handled. But like, how did you feel this author tackled that so well?
So one of the things that I think she does really well is portray the triumph of the human spirit. And also, I believe she gives us a sense of good winning over evil. But I hesitate even to use those terms, because the way that she writes about that earthquake, there is nothing evil necessarily about it. Evil suggests an intent, but it's very clear that the people in this book are at the almost at the whim of nature. So this is a natural disaster. This is something that cannot be avoided. It can only be endured. And what allows these characters to transcend is not the tragedy of the event, but the humanity of their response to it. And again, I keep saying it's hard to talk about good and evil, because there is, for example, a character in this novel who collects water. You know, people are suffering this event, this earthquake. Nothing is the same. There's all this devastation. There's this suffering. And people are sharing water, and they are sharing necessities. And the woman who has lost her children and seems to be losing her mind as well is cared for by a family of sorts that isn't the family that she would have had prior to this event, prior to the earthquake. So people are thrown together in difficult circumstances, and their humanity is what stands out. It is how they care for each other, even to the extent of, there's a part of the book where a character is killed, essentially, because of the level of their suffering. It's clear that they will not be able to survive it, and therefore death in that context is a kind of a mercy. And somebody is willing to extend that mercy. So when normally if you read something like that, you'd be like, oh my gosh, that's horrible, how could they? But the way that the author writes it is so clear that this is a kind kindness. So people's ability to be kind and to be considerate and to put others before self and to think about the survival of the collective as opposed to, just any benefits that the individual can derive. I mean, there are some characters like that in the book. And those are dealt with, I think, in a very satisfying way. They either are redeemed in some way by the end of the novel, or they're done away with it, which I like. It's kind of reassuring.
Yeah.
It's reassuring, like, because this is something that we can't even fathom. This kind of tragedy, this kind of natural disaster, we can't even think about what we would do in those circumstances. And it is a little bit of a comfort to see that sort of triumph of the human spirit, and to see that that humanity in approach, and to see that community, and to see that consideration. So, I mean, it is very difficult subject matter, but I think that is one of the things that allows us to get through it. The way that we sort of pull together and help each other in those circumstances.
And what a lovely note to end on.
I know.
Let's all be friends.
I mean,
that's all she wrote.
Some incredible recommendations.
Fantastic recommendations.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad you thought so too. These are books that have changed me. All of them. Walked into them one version of myself and came out a different version, and so much better for the experience. So I hope that people who listen to the podcast and read these books have that experience and come away, feeling as if they were changed and uplifted, and they have a lot to think about at the end of that experience.
I'm sure they will.
They better. And we've got me to answer to.
Yes.
So what we like to end on is, again, just to make sure we've got as many recommendations out of you as is humanly possible, is to ask you about any authors or novels that have inspired you or your work.
As well as the ones we've spoken about.
As well as all of these, of course.
There are so many. I mean, how much time do we have again? But I can talk about some, mostly from the period when I was kind of, I think, beginning to come into my own as a writer and recognize that this was something that was a calling for me and something that would stay with me for the rest of my life. So the one book that I think really stays with me even up to now is by a Trinidadian author called Earl Lovelace. And the name of that book is The Wine of Astonishment. And it's about what they call in Trinidad the Shouter Baptists. We call them the spiritual Baptists. It's a particular type of religion, and they worship in a particular way. They ring bells, they sing a lot, and so on. But I love that novel, so I'm not going to go into it too much. I'll just say that is, top of the books that shaped my life and even my style and as a writer. So The Wine of Astonishment by Earl Lovelace, Toni Morrison, of course, The Bluest Eye, Song of Solomon. Oh gosh, there's so many. Alice Walker, The Color Purple, Olive Senior, Caribbean writer again, Summer Lightning and Other Stories, Jamaica Kincaid, Annie John, what else? Claude McKay, Banana Bottom, My Antonia, Thomas Hardy. There's so many books. I could just go on and on.
I love
The Chrysalis, John Wyndham. I could just keep going. But those are some of the books that I remember reading, and just again, they stay with me, and I go back to them from time to time. I'll read them over at different points of my life, and always get something new from those texts. So yeah, those are some of the books for me.
Right,
Nice.
no one can accuse us of not getting enough recommendations today.
But finally, we do have another recommendation.
Oh yeah,
which is there anything that you've been enjoying recently that you would like to recommend? Any cultural recommendations for us?
What have I been well, there was the one that I told you about. Recently, I've been doing quite a bit of writing, and I tend to read a little less when I'm in a writing phase. But I read this book called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl while I was in Iowa. And that book had a pretty profound impact on, my understanding of, a part of history. I actually had some issues with the way that the book was written, but I think it's a fascinating study of, it's put across as a first-hand account of slavery from the perspective of a slave girl, during that aspect of Caribbean, of history, not the Caribbean, because it's not based in the Caribbean, but that was a very interesting book for me, very moving. I do have some issues with it, but we're not in a quarrel about that now. So that is something that I read recently that I think everybody should read. Yes.
Amazing. And that I have just noticed that we've gone way over time. So
thank you for so long. We're sorry.
We're sorry, but we're also not, because we've loved talking to you. This was amazing.
I love talking to you too. Thank you so much for your patience and for giving me a little. I needed it, and I am just so glad that we actually got the chance to
me too.
Share about these books.
And thank you for all your wonderful recommendations. I mean, is there anything, we obviously waxed lyrical at the start about your amazing debut, but is there anything that we've got to look forward to with you?
Oh yes, I've been working on this book called Nib. So I've gone the 180 degrees in the opposite direction, from a very long title to a very short one. I don't know if that's what will be the title on publication, but I'm writing this coming of age story about a 13-year-old girl called Nib who lives on a cocoa plantation and is actually very much influenced by a trans woman in the post-emancipation period in the Caribbean. So for me, that was just the story that came to me, and I found it challenging in one sense to try to do that research and get that information about that period of our history, but also about trans women within that context, because like every other type of human being that we have now, they've existed at all periods of time, but in some ways they're just not represented. We're not represented. Some women are not represented in certain parts of history. So it's a coming of age story. 13-year-old girl called Nib living on a cocoa plantation post-emancipation period. And I hope that people will enjoy it as much as I've enjoyed writing about these characters who are still in my head. So that's what's happening.
Oh, we're so excited.
So excited, you have no idea. You have to promise us that you'll come back and tell us all about it when it's coming out.
Oh, absolutely. I think you realize now how much I can talk. So
yes,
we love that.
Once you'll have me, I'm there.
Absolutely. Yes, please come back. Listeners, thank you so much for listening to this episode. Please do rate, review and subscribe, as it helps to boost us in the chart. We will be putting a link in the show notes to Cherie's wonderful book. If you've not read it yet, what are you doing? Click the link, get it bought, get reading.
Guys,
come on.
Careful now, because I'm going to get angry.
And you don't want that. But yes,
no.
Really don't.
Thank you so much, Cherie. This has honestly been amazing. This has been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
And listeners, goodbye.